The fog clung to the pines like a shroud, muting the world into shades of grey as the old pickup rattled down the overgrown dirt road. Deep in the heart of rural Maine, where the trees whispered secrets to anyone foolish enough to listen, the Harlan farm stood as a forgotten relic, its weathered boards groaning under the weight of decades. Eleanor Harlan ruled this forsaken patch of earth with an iron will, her 5 sons, Jacob, Elias, Caleb, Micah, and the youngest, Seth, trapped in her web of devotion and dread. They worked the land from dawn till dusk, their hands calloused, their eyes hollow, speaking little beyond the necessities of survival. But at night, when the wind howled through the cracks, strange voices drifted from the dark woods beyond the barn, faint murmurs that sounded almost like pleas or warnings. Eleanor dismissed them as the imaginings of weak minds, her voice sharp as a blade. The world out there is poison. Here, we preserve what's pure. Yet Jacob, the eldest, felt the chill deepen each time he glanced at the padlocked barn door, its rusted chains hiding something that twisted his gut. Little did he know, those voices were just the beginning, echoes of a horror that had festered for years, waiting to unravel the fragile threads holding their family together. Deep in the pine-choked hollows of northern Maine, the Harlan farm sat 3 miles down a rutted track that no county map bothered to name anymore. The nearest neighbor had vanished 20 years earlier, and the power lines never reached this far. What electricity they had came from a wheezing diesel generator that Eleanor allowed to run only 4 hours each evening. The rest of the time the house lived in lamplight and shadow, the way she preferred it. Eleanor Harlan was 58 but looked older, her face carved deep by wind and unrelenting purpose. Tall and raw-boned, she moved with the deliberate certainty of someone who had never once been told no and lived to see the consequences. Her graying hair was always pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin across her cheekbones, giving her eyes a permanent, predatory focus. She spoke softly when she gave orders, the kind of softness that made the sons strain to hear and obey faster. Jacob, 36, was the tallest and the quietest, his shoulders stooped from years of plowing by hand. Elias, 2 years younger, still carried the quick temper of youth but had learned to swallow it the way a man swallows broken glass. Caleb and Micah, 29 and 28, were mirror images of each other, thin and pale, their identical silences louder than shouting. Seth, barely 24, had been born after Eleanor declared the outside world finished and the bloodline hers to protect. He had never seen a town larger than the feed store 15 miles away, and even that trip had ended when he was 9. From sunrise they worked, milking the handful of cows, mending fences that didn't need mending, cutting firewood far more than 5 men and 1 woman could ever burn. Eleanor watched from the porch rocker, Bible closed on her lap though she never opened it, her lips moving in silent calculation. She rationed their words the way she rationed salt, insisting that idle talk invited the devil through the cracks. Letters never came. The rusted mailbox at the end of the track had been nailed shut the year Seth was born. A single battery radio had once existed, but it disappeared after Jacob was caught listening to a baseball game in 2009. At supper they sat in birth order, backs straight, eyes down. Eleanor served from the same iron pot every night, ladling thin stew while reciting the duties of flesh and blood. The sons ate in perfect silence, chewing slowly because chewing too fast earned a stare that could last for days. When the plates were clean she would lean forward, elbows on the oilcloth, and remind them that the world beyond the tree line was diseased, that only here, under her hand, could purity survive. They nodded because nodding was safer than speaking, and because some part of each of them, worn thin as fence wire, still believed her. The first time Eleanor laid the demand bare, Jacob was 21 and the frost had only just left the ground. He had come in from chopping wood, shoulders burning, to find her waiting in the narrow hallway between the kitchen and the stairs. The lamp was turned low, throwing her shadow long across the floorboards like a second, darker woman standing behind her. She did not raise her voice. She never needed to. "You're a man now," she said, the words flat and certain, as if she were telling him the sky was blue. "The bloodline thins when it mixes with outsiders. God showed me in a dream what has to be done." Jacob laughed once, a short, cracked sound that died the instant her eyes narrowed. He thought she was testing him the way she tested them about stealing sugar or sneaking glances at the Sears catalog that had arrived by mistake years earlier. But she stepped closer, close enough that he smelled wood smoke on her dress and the faint sourness of her skin, and she laid her palm flat against his chest, right over his heart. "Jacob," she whispered, "you will give me a child. A pure child. The first of many." He tried to step back and found the wall already there. His mind scrambled for the old punishments: no supper, extra chores, the belt she hadn't used since he was 12, anything that made sense. Instead she took his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong, and guided his hand beneath the hem of her dress, pressing his fingers against the warm skin of her belly as though planting a seed by force. That night she came to his room. The door had no lock, none of them did. She carried no lamp, moving by memory through the dark house the way a wolf moves through its own territory. She told him resistance was the same as murder, that refusing her was refusing God, that every generation before them had understood the necessity of keeping the line unbroken and clean. She spoke in the same measured cadence she used when quoting scripture she had invented years ago, verses no Bible had ever held. When it was over she stayed long enough to stroke his hair once, the way she had when he was small and fevered, then rose and left without a sound. In the morning she served oatmeal as if the world had not tilted on its axis, watching him eat with the calm satisfaction of a farmer who has just set the first post of a new fence. Jacob swallowed the mush and tasted ash. He stared at the table's scarred surface and understood, with a clarity that made his stomach lurch, that the fence was already built and he was inside it forever. The first months after that night, Jacob lived in a haze of dread and disbelief. He waited for the guilt to burn him alive, for Elias or the younger boys to notice the way their mother sometimes rested her hand on Jacob's shoulder a fraction longer than before. But nothing changed at the table, nothing in the rhythm of chores. Eleanor carried on with the serene certainty of a woman who had prayed for rain and watched the clouds obey. When her belly began to swell, she announced it at supper the way she might announce a good price on feed corn. "The Lord has blessed us," she said, eyes shining with something fiercer than joy. "Jacob has done his duty." The younger boys stared at their bowls. Elias's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth and stayed there, trembling. No one asked questions. Questions were weeds, and Eleanor had always been ruthless with weeds. The child, a girl with Jacob's dark hair and Eleanor's pale eyes, was born in the upstairs bedroom while a February nor'easter screamed against the windows. Eleanor refused the county midwife, refused even to let Jacob fetch the old doctor from town. She labored alone, biting down on a leather strap, emerging hours later with the infant wrapped in a flour sack blanket. She named the baby Ruth and laid her in a cradle that had once held Seth. Then she looked at Elias, only 19, and said, "Your turn will come soon enough." Resistance, when it surfaced, was small and pitiful. Elias tried locking his door with a chair under the knob. Eleanor simply waited until he fell asleep exhausted and removed the chair. Caleb and Micah whispered once in the hayloft about running, about stealing the truck keys and driving until the road ended. They abandoned the plan the same night Eleanor found their cached cans of beans and poured them into the pig trough without a word. One by one the barriers crumbled. Fear of her rage, fear of the outside world she had painted as a cesspool of disease and sin, fear of damnation itself. Each fear was a stone in the wall she built around them. She rewarded submission with extra portions of meat, with a softer tone that felt, after years of sharpness, like mercy. She punished hesitation with silence that could stretch for days, silence so complete the house seemed to hold its breath until lungs burned. By the time Seth, barely 16, was led upstairs on a moonless August night, the pattern was as fixed as the seasons. The boys no longer flinched when she touched their faces at the table. They had learned the same lesson livestock learn: the hand that feeds can also choke, and it is wiser to stand still. Years folded into one another like the pages of a book no one was allowed to open. The farm became a closed mouth, swallowing every sound that might have escaped. Ruth grew into a silent, watchful child with her grandmother's pale eyes, followed by 3 more daughters and then a boy, all carried by Eleanor in rapid succession, each birth announced with the same calm triumph: another pure soul for the line. After the 5th pregnancy left her weakened and bleeding for weeks, she declared the vessel had served its purpose and turned her gaze fully to the next generation. The older sons were summoned in order now, not just to her bed but to the beds of their own half-sisters once the girls reached what Eleanor deemed ripe. The house grew crowded with small feet that learned early to walk without noise. Births were hidden in the attic during the loudest thunderstorms, baptisms performed by lantern light with water from the rain barrel. Death certificates were never filed. Tiny bodies that did not thrive were wrapped in feed sacks and carried past the barn to a clearing deep in the pines where the soil stayed soft. To the outside world, if it ever thought of the Harlans at all, the farm was simply abandoned. The tax notices stopped coming after Eleanor burned them in the cookstove year after year. The only vehicle, an ancient Ford pickup, had not moved since its battery died in 2014. Supplies came from a single yearly trip Jacob was permitted to make to the distant feed store, cash only, no questions, head down, list memorized. He bought flour, salt, nails, kerosene, and the plain cotton cloth Eleanor used for everything from bandages to shrouds. Inside the boundary of the tree line, the family multiplied in shadows. The daughters, raised on the same lessons of purity and duty, accepted their roles with the numb obedience their fathers had perfected. New infants arrived almost every year, some with the same pale eyes, some with defects Eleanor blamed on insufficient devotion. The boys, there were always fewer boys, were kept apart, watched closely, taught from the cradle that their seed belonged to the family and to no one else. The barn, once used only for hay and a handful of cows, gradually changed. A false wall was built at the back, creating a hidden wing reached by a crawlspace under the floorboards. There the youngest children were kept when strangers were rumored to be near, hunters, loggers, the occasional lost hiker. The space smelled of milk and damp straw and fear. At night the older sons carried meals there, moving like ghosts, speaking in whispers that grew shorter every year. By the time Seth's first child was born, a girl with his narrow shoulders and Eleanor's unblinking stare, the farm had become its own sealed universe. 23 souls lived within its fences, every one of them bound by blood that had circled back on itself too many times to count. And still the woods pressed closer, pines leaning inward as if listening, waiting for the moment when the weight of all those hidden lives would finally split the silence wide open. The first voice came to Seth on a night when the wind had teeth. He was 28, crossing the yard with a lantern to check the cows, when the sound slipped between the pines like a ribbon of smoke. A woman's voice, thin and papery, saying his name once, clear as a struck bell. Seth froze, lantern trembling, the flame guttering in its glass chimney. He told himself it was the wind playing tricks, the way it always did, threading through the needles and making them sigh. But the voice came again, closer now, almost inside his ear. Seth, remember. He ran the rest of the way to the barn, boots slipping on frost, heart hammering so hard he tasted iron. Inside, the cows shifted uneasily, eyes rolling white. He stood among them until the lantern burned low, too afraid to go back across the open yard. After that, the voices multiplied. They never spoke in daylight, only after the generator coughed itself silent and the house sank into its nightly dark. Jacob heard them first as footsteps overhead when everyone was accounted for downstairs. Elias woke once to a child's laughter right beside his bed, yet the room was empty. Caleb and Micah began sleeping with their heads under quilts, claiming the whispers crawled inside their skulls and nested there. The voices were never angry. That was the worst part. They were soft, pleading, sometimes singing fragments of lullabies Eleanor had forbidden years ago. One night Micah heard his own dead infant daughter, the one born blue and buried without a name, calling Papa from the direction of the hidden clearing. He stumbled outside barefoot in February and stood screaming at the trees until Jacob dragged him back inside, both of them shaking too hard to speak. Eleanor forbade mention of the voices. She said they were demons sent to test faith, that only the weak heard them. But the sons noticed how she now carried the shotgun even to the outhouse, how she sometimes paused on the porch at dusk and stared toward the tree line as though expecting someone to step out. She doubled the nightly prayers, making them repeat verses about obedience until their throats rasped raw. Yet the voices grew bolder. They began naming things no living soul should know, the exact spot under the lilac bush where Ruth's first stillborn lay, the date Elias had once tried to hang himself in the hayloft and been cut down by Caleb. They spoke of chains and fire and a barn that would drink blood before the end. And always, threaded beneath every word, was the same patient promise: soon. The attic was forbidden unless Eleanor sent someone up for Christmas ornaments or winter blankets. The trapdoor stuck, warped by decades of damp, and the ladder groaned like it resented being used. Jacob climbed it one October afternoon when Eleanor had taken to her bed with a fever that made her skin burn and her eyes glassy. The younger children were kept downstairs with broth and warnings, so for once the house was quiet enough to think. He told himself he was looking for the old kerosene heater. In truth, he was chasing a memory, a tin box their father had kept on the highest shelf, the one Eleanor had thrown into the stove the week after he died. Jacob had been 16 then, old enough to notice how quickly the flames took the papers inside. The attic smelled of mouse nests and cedar gone sour. Sunlight leaked through one cracked pane, striping the floorboards with pale bars. He moved slowly, knees creaking, past trunks of moth-eaten quilts and crates of mason jars Eleanor had never filled. At the far end, behind a stack of splintered apple crates, he found a loose floorboard. When he pried it up, the tin box was there, smaller than he remembered, its lid dented and green with verdigris. Inside lay photographs and letters folded so many times the creases had turned to cuts. The pictures were old, sepia fading to ghost. A woman who looked like Eleanor but younger, standing beside a man with the same hollow cheeks the sons now wore. On the back, someone had written Mama and Uncle Ezra, 1943. Another photo showed the same woman heavy with child, the man's hand possessive on her belly. A third image made Jacob's breath stop, the barn as it had looked 70 years earlier, its back wall already hiding the false room, a padlock gleaming new on a side door that no longer existed. The letters were worse. They were written in different hands, some in pencil, some in ink gone brown. A great-aunt named Abigail describing how her brother had been chosen at 14. A grandmother named Ruth, the same name Eleanor had given her first daughter, confessing she had borne 7 children by her own sons before the fever took her. One sheet, brittle as dead leaves, listed births and deaths in careful columns, 1912, 1927, 1944, 1961, 1988. The pattern was identical every generation. The women ruled until the boys grew strong enough to refuse, then the barn claimed another keeper. Jacob sat on the dusty floor until the light failed, reading by the last red sliver through the window. When he finally climbed down, tin box clutched against his chest, the house felt smaller, the walls leaning inward like the sides of a grave already dug. The barn at midnight smelled of old hay, axle grease, and the sour milk the children spilled in the hidden room. Jacob waited until Eleanor's laudanum-laced tea had pulled her under. Her snores drifted down the stairwell like a distant saw. One by one the brothers slipped out, moving barefoot across the cold yard so their boots wouldn't clank on the frost. They met inside the main bay where the tractor had not run in 8 years, its seat cracked and spilling mouse-chewed foam. Jacob laid the tin box on an overturned feed barrel. The single lantern threw their shadows high against the rafters, turning 5 grown men into giants with broken backs. No one spoke until Elias reached out and flipped the lid open himself, the hinges screaming like something alive. When he saw the photographs he made a sound low in his throat, half laugh, half sob, then passed them down the line. Caleb read the birth columns aloud in a whisper that still cracked on every date. Micah traced the name Ruth, his own daughter's name, written in 1944 and again in 1988 and again in last year's dirt beneath the lilac bush. Seth, youngest and least able to hide what he felt, began shaking so hard his teeth clicked. "We leave tonight," Elias said when the silence grew too sharp. "We take the kids, we burn the house if we have to, we walk till we hit a road." Jacob shook his head once, slow. "She'll wake. She always wakes. And even if we make the tree line, where do we go with 23 mouths and no money, no names the world recognizes?" "Then we kill her," Caleb said, the words flat, already decided somewhere deeper than thought. Micah nodded immediately. Seth looked sick but did not look away. They argued in circles for an hour, voices rising only to be swallowed again by fear. Killing her felt both impossible and inevitable, like trying to imagine cutting off your own hand to escape a trap. Running felt the same. The outside world was a story Eleanor had told so many times they half believed it was radioactive. In the end they did what they always did. They postponed the decision, agreeing only to meet again the next night, and the next, until the plan felt less like treason and more like breathing. Night after night they gathered, 5 shadows around the weak circle of lantern light, mapping routes on scraps of feed sack, counting bullets in the shotgun they were never allowed to touch, rehearsing how they would carry the smallest children through the dark. Each meeting left them more exhausted than the last, as though planning freedom cost more strength than surrender ever had. And every time they stepped back into the house, the floorboards seemed to watch them, waiting for the moment when wanting would finally turn into doing. October slid into November with a rawness that bit straight through flannel. The brothers had settled into their secret meetings like men learning to breathe underwater, slow, deliberate, terrified of surfacing too soon. They had chosen a night, the first hard freeze, when the ground would carry no footprints and the generator's cough would mask the creak of the barn door. They had even pried a rusted crowbar from beneath the tractor seat and hidden it behind a loose board, a silent vote that words had finally failed. Then the outsider came. He appeared at the edge of the south field just after noon, a thin man in an orange hunting coat too bright for the grey woods, rifle slung easy on his shoulder. Lost, he would claim later, though no one would ever hear his side. He had followed a deer trail that wasn't supposed to connect to anything, pushed through a wall of hemlock, and stepped into the Harlan clearing as though the trees had parted for him. Seth saw him first from the loft window where he was stacking hay. The orange coat burned against the brown world like a flare. Seth's stomach dropped so hard he nearly fell from the ladder. By the time he reached the yard, Jacob and Elias were already there, standing shoulder to shoulder with pitchforks that looked casual until you noticed the white knuckles. The stranger raised a hand, friendly, city-friendly. "Hey there. Sorry to bother you folks. GPS crapped out 2 hours ago. Any chance of a drink of water and a point toward Route 11? Eleanor came out of the house faster than any of them had seen her move in years. The shotgun was in her hands before the screen door slapped shut. The stranger's smile faltered, the rifle stayed slung, barrel down, but his eyes flicked to the weapon and back to her face. "Private property," she said, voice soft as always, soft as a garrote. "Turn around and walk the way you came." The man tried again, slower, palms open. I'm happy to leave, just need to know I'm not walking in circles." She raised the shotgun. Not high, just enough that the twin barrels pointed at his knees. "I won't ask twice." He backed away, boots crunching on frost-stiff grass, the orange coat retreating until the trees swallowed it. The brothers stood frozen, waiting for the sound of a truck that never started, waiting for sirens that never came. Only when the last flash of color vanished did Eleanor lower the gun. She turned to them, eyes bright with something that might have been fear or triumph. "That," she said, "is why we stay pure." That night she did not sleep. She walked the porch with the shotgun across her arms until the sky paled, and the brothers knew the crowbar behind the board had just become useless. The world had reached in once and been bitten, it would not reach again quietly. Whatever they did now would have to be finished before another orange coat found the path. The night after the hunter vanished into the trees, the voices changed. They no longer drifted like smoke, they poured. Every brother woke at the same moment, as though a hand had clamped over each mouth and then released it. The house filled with sound that had no source, women weeping, children laughing too close to the ear, a low chorus of names spoken in perfect unison: Abigail, Ruth, Esther, Mercy, all the dead mothers going back a century. Jacob sat up in bed and saw shapes at the footboard, translucent silhouettes of girls in flour sack dresses, eyes black as wet stones. They did not move their lips, yet he heard them clearly. She lied. The world is still there. End it before the next one is born. Downstairs, Elias found the kitchen full of footprints in the flour he had spilled the day before and never swept. The prints were small, barefoot, leading from the pantry to the locked cellar door and back again, dozens of them, as though an army of children had marched in circles while he slept. When he tried to brush them away, the broom passed through air already clean, the prints remained, glowing faintly. Caleb and Micah met in the hallway without speaking, drawn by the same pull. A single sentence hung between them, spoken by no mouth: "The barn is hungry." They looked at each other and understood the words were not metaphor. Something inside the false room wanted feeding, and Eleanor had been the one holding the plate. Seth, youngest and most brittle, walked straight out into the yard in nothing but long underwear. The voices followed him, louder, intimate, stroking the inside of his skull. They told him exactly where the hunter's body lay, 3 miles east, tangled in a blowdown, orange coat snagged on a branch like a flag of surrender. They told him the man had a wife and a little girl waiting beside a cold dinner in Bangor. They told him the wife would never stop looking. Then they told him what to do. When Seth came back inside, his bare feet left no prints on the frost. His eyes were wide and calm, the way a man looks when the worst decision has already been made for him. He walked past his brothers without seeing them and went to the cupboard where Eleanor kept the good rope, the thick hemp she had bought the year the well collapsed and needed hauling. He coiled it over his shoulder the way he once coiled binder twine, methodical, almost gentle. Upstairs, Eleanor stirred in her sleep and smiled at dreams she believed were prophecy. Downstairs, the voices settled into a single steady note, patient as a heartbeat, promising the brothers that every link in the chain had to be forged by their own hands. The night they chose was the 1st of December, the sky black and brittle as burnt paper. Snow had begun to fall in slow, deliberate flakes, each one sticking to the ground like a seal on a letter that would never be opened again. The brothers moved through the house without a word, gathering the things they had rehearsed for weeks, the crowbar, the good rope, the shotgun Eleanor kept under her bed. They left the children sleeping in the attic, doors wedged shut with chairs so the smallest ones could not wander downstairs and witness what was coming. Eleanor was awake when they entered her room. She sat upright in the narrow bed, hair loose for once, white strands floating around her face like frost on a windowpane. The lantern Jacob carried threw her shadow huge against the wall, a giantess with arms outstretched. She did not look surprised, only disappointed, the way she had looked when they were boys and forgot to close the barn door. "You came to thank me," she said softly, "for keeping you safe." Jacob stepped forward first. He had rehearsed this moment in every quiet hour for months, but now the words stuck in his throat. Instead he simply reached out and took her wrist. She did not resist, she let him pull her from the bed as though she had always known this night would arrive. The others followed, forming a silent circle around her as they walked her down the stairs and across the yard. Snowflakes caught in her hair and melted against the heat of her skin. The barn door swung open with a groan that sounded almost welcoming. Inside, the lantern light reached only as far as the false wall, leaving the hidden room in darkness. Eleanor walked ahead of them, barefoot on the cold boards, until she stood in the exact center of the space where she had once delivered her own children and later ordered theirs. She turned to face them, eyes bright with the same calm certainty that had ruled them all their lives. "You'll never be free," she said. "The blood remembers." Caleb stepped forward and looped the rope around her wrists. She did not fight, she only watched him with something close to pity. Micah and Elias lifted her arms and fastened the rope to the heavy iron ring bolted into the main beam, the same ring that had once held the milk cows. She hung there, feet barely touching the floor, back straight, chin lifted. Jacob took the padlock from his pocket, the one she had used on the false wall for 20 years, and clicked it shut through the iron links. When it was done they stood in silence, listening to the wind rattle the tin roof. Eleanor looked at each of them in turn, her gaze lingering longest on Seth. Then she smiled, small and terrible. "You'll come back to me," she whispered. "You always do." They left her there, chained in the darkness of the barn she had built, the snow falling thicker now, burying their footprints as they walked back to the house. The first dawn after the chaining was the quietest the farm had ever known. No generator coughed to life, no children cried for milk, no voice rose in prayer or command. Snow kept falling, soft and relentless, erasing the path between house and barn as though the night itself had been a dream they could still wake from. Jacob stood at the kitchen window until the glass fogged with his breath. Behind him the others moved like sleepwalkers, filling kettles, counting mouths, trying to remember how ordinary families began an ordinary day. The children, released from the attic, clustered in corners and stared at the adults with eyes too old for their faces. No one had told them yet what waited in the barn, but they knew something had broken. The air felt thinner, as if the house had been holding its breath for decades and finally let go. By noon the snow was knee-deep and still coming. Elias tried the truck. The battery was long dead and the tires frozen to the ground. Caleb found the radio Eleanor had hidden years ago, but the only station it caught was static threaded with a faint, familiar whispering. They turned it off quickly and did not try again. On the second day the voices returned, not pleading now but satisfied, almost tender. They spoke from the walls, from the rafters, from the milk pails lined up like soldiers. They told the brothers where to find the money Eleanor had sewn into the mattress, the birth certificates she had burned, the map to a back road that left the county without passing a single house. They told them the hunter's body had already been covered by drifts, that no one would come looking until spring, maybe not even then. On the third night Seth walked to the barn alone. The padlock was iced over, he chipped at it with the crowbar until his hands bled, but he could not bring himself to open the door. Inside, something moved, heavy chains dragging across boards, a low sound that might have been breathing or might have been laughter. He stood there until the cold numbed his feet, then turned back to the house without a word. By the end of the week the snow had stopped, leaving the world clean and featureless. The brothers loaded the children into 2 old sleds and began walking north, following the tree line the way the voices instructed. They left the barn locked, the house dark, the fields to whatever would claim them. Behind them the pines closed ranks again, needles whispering over fresh white silence. Years later, when searchers finally reached the farm after a missing persons report that led nowhere and everywhere, they found the house stripped bare, the hidden room full of tiny shoes no child had worn in a decade, and the barn door chained from the outside. Inside hung a skeleton in a rotted dress, wrists still bound, mouth open as if forever speaking to an empty room. No one ever found the brothers or the children. The woods kept their secret, and on certain nights when the wind moves just right through the pines, travelers still hear voices drifting from the dark, soft, patient, and waiting.